paper reports that two of the male prostitutes were given a late-night tour of the White House last year.
You want answers. I want the truth. You can't handle the truth.
Welcome to the Nick Bryant Podcast. Today, my guest is Thomas Maier. He's an award-winning author, journalist, and television producer. His book, Masters of Sex, was the basis for an Emmy-winning Showtime drama that ran for 4 seasons. His other books include When Lions Roar, The Churchills, and the Kennedys. And he wrote a second book about the Kennedys, America's Emerald Kings. And he wrote Newhouse, All the Glitter, Power, and Glory of America's Richest Media Empire, and the Secretive Man Behind It. He has worked as an investigative reporter for Newsday for over 30 years. And today we're going to talk about his latest offering, Mafia Spies, the inside story of the CIA, gangsters, JFK, and Castro. Welcome to the Nick Bryant Podcast.
Thank you for inviting me, Nick. I really appreciate it.
I was very enthralled by your book because it addresses a part of history that I knew about, but it gave nuances. Tell us a little bit about Mafia Spies.
Well, Mafia Spies grew out of my own, as you mentioned, I've written books about the Kennedys previously. So there was a little flick in both books, previous books about the Kennedys, that I mentioned about Sam Giancana. But it wasn't until I did subsequent research that I realized the relationship, this kind of outlaw friendship that Sam Giancana had with Johnny Roselli, another mobster, that for me, it kind of provided the biographical window that I could tell this story of how these two gangsters were hired by the CIA to kill Castro and take a lot of stuff that had been out there, pull it all together. But the thing that also particularly made it more valuable, I think, for the reader, and generally historically, is that about 5 years ago, a lot of the JFK assassination files that had been kept top secret for 50, 60 years, they were released under the law by then President Trump in the era of 2017-18. That was when I was putting together this book. And that provided a lot of information, particularly about this whole effort by the CIA to kill Castro. And even though these papers, the JFK files that were released, didn't really provide any substantively new information precisely about who killed JFK in Dallas, 1963, what it did provide was a lot of information about something that really was not reviewed by the Warren Commission when it investigated Kennedy's death. And that is the fact that the CIA had planned to kill Castro, and that Castro said a few months before the JFK assassination, he said, "I know you're trying to kill me. I'm aware of this." And he also said, essentially, two can play this game. And the Warren Commission did not look at this. So these papers provide a lot of information about this undeclared war that the United States government was running out of southern Florida in the Miami area, where people like the Attorney General, Robert F. Kennedy, was flying down. He was essentially wearing 2 hats as the Attorney General and essentially as the overseer of the CIA in Florida. And also about how Castro managed to avoid getting assassination. That whole effort to kill Castro resembled kind of that whack-a-mole game of that when you go to an amusement park, with the big mallet and you try to bop the the mole with the mallet. Well, that was kind of like what the CIA attempt was. There were a lot of attempts, but no one ever quite got Castro. And these papers that became available 5 years ago kind of give more of an indication of why. And what I realized is that Castro had a lot of informants, double agents in Florida as well as Cuba. And so that provided a lot of granular detail that really enhances Mafia Spies.
So Eisenhower, according to your book, Eisenhower was the prime mover as far as putting a contract out on Fidel Castro.
Right. It's easy to sign off on things when you're going out the door, right?
And the CIA people knew that they needed to get an intermediary. And that intermediary is a very interesting guy. His name is Bob Mayu.
He sure
was
is.
with the FBI and the CIA, and he ultimately governed Howard Hughes's empire. And
yeah.
And even though he'd never met Howard Hughes,
Yeah,
I've always let's talk a little bit about Mayu first.
Right, sure. Well, just to go back what you're saying, the official Washington, that Eisenhower, he oversaw D-Day. He oversaw. He was the commander for this great victory in World War II, and becomes president. And so the United States really reigned supreme in the world. We had the shooting of the launching of the Sputnik satellite in 1957 by the Russians, and suddenly the idea that they're the first ones out in space, that they could put an atomic bomb on the top of conceivably of a rocket like that certainly sent shivers. But then when Castro came to power, that was the other second big thing that really rattled things. And so it was determined to get rid of Castro, and that the CIA would oversee this. But the CIA was run fundamentally by a group of Ivy League fellows who didn't really want to get their hands bloody. So they looked for an intermediary, a middleman. In CIA parlance, it's called a cutout. And this buffer was a guy named Robert Mayu. And as you say, he worked for Howard Hughes, the richest man in America. Robert Mayu had been an FBI agent. He did a number of different kind of dirty tricks jobs for the CIA prior to this. But this one was a biggie. This one was where the CIA was now essentially going from collecting information, intelligence, to now the world of covert operations, specifically trying to assassinate a foreign leader. And so they, at least back in the 1960s, they felt they wouldn't have any immunity. If somebody found out about this, they might all go to jail. So they wanted to have an intermediary, and that became Robert Mayu. And so there were people in the CIA who had dealt with Mayu, asked him, did he know anybody? And Mayu said, yeah, I think I know somebody who could do this for us. And after much pondering back and forth, Mayu put it all together. And he's the one who contacted Johnny Roselli and eventually Sam Giancana. And the first big meeting of the CIA and the mobsters takes place at the Fontainebleau Hotel. And that's about March of 1960, while Eisenhower is still the president.
And that's in Florida.
Yeah, it's at the Fontainebleau Hotel in the Boom Boom Room, no less, in Miami Beach. It's, if you ever watch the beginning of Goldfinger, the James Bond movie, there's that wonderful brassy music, and they do a sweeping view of the Fontainebleau, which is this big, white, huge building. Hotel with a large pool, and that's where they spent the weekend. And interestingly enough, that same time period, Frank Sinatra, who was friendly, very friendly with Sam Giancana, he was down there filming a TV special in which Elvis Presley appeared. So there's actually, if you go to YouTube, there's actually video of Sinatra and Elvis singing together. But that same time period, he's down there with Sam Giancana and Johnny Roselli. This is Sinatra. So it's quite an assemblage of remarkable characters. And that's when, during this time period in which the mob and the CIA talk about exactly how they're going to kill Fidel Castro.
What's interesting is, to me, the mob is very good at killing people. We've seen that over the years. And Sam Giancana was known for his homicidal tendencies. People were, I mean, he was called Mooney because people thought that he was crazy.
Yeah.
And Roselli was pretty smooth. He was a good-looking guy, and he did a lot of the rackets in Hollywood. That was kind of his specialty. He was in Los Angeles. And Mayu, do we really is it possible to really know how Mayu met Roselli and Giancana?
Yeah, I describe it, for our interview, I'm just kind of boiling things down. But in my book, I describe the history of Mayu, his relationship with the CIA and the various people involved in the various different steps that lead up to that meeting at the Fontainebleau Hotel. There were previous meetings and such. But, the thing about when you talk about the two major characters in Mafia Spies, Johnny Roselli and Sam Giancana was kind of like the Tony Soprano, almost like the traditional mob figure, in the sense that, like Tony Soprano, he's out in the suburbs. Sam was out in the suburbs of Chicago. He had a wife and 3 teenage daughters. He had a girlfriend on the side, but fundamentally he adored his wife, put her up on a pedestal. And then one day his wife drops dead, screaming at their oldest daughter, Antoinette Giancana, who is now incidentally 88 years old, and she's in Mafia Spies, the Paramount TV show that's going to be on. She's actually arguably one of the best interviews in the whole show. But it throws off Sam, needless to say. Suddenly he's a bachelor mobster with 3 teenage daughters. And he goes, essentially, he is still looking for a replacement, for somebody to adore. And so he goes out to Las Vegas and starts spending more and more time with his old friend, Johnny Roselli. Roselli's a very different type of guy. He is more, his nickname was Handsome Johnny. It's more like a Casanova type. And that was something that really intrigued me about the two of them, that they're two very different, almost archetype of men. The guy who likes to be married and the guy who really doesn't want to be married, but he does love women. And so he goes out with various different actresses, Lana Turner, Donna Reed from It's a Wonderful Life, Marilyn Monroe, he knows her. And he's also introduced to a woman. He lives in this very posh condominium in Los Angeles called the Garden of Allah. And that's where a lot of actors, young actors and actresses live. And he meets this woman who, her name is Judy Campbell, and she's kind of described as a young Elizabeth Taylor type. That's how she looks. But she first dates Johnny, and Johnny eventually introduces her to Frank Sinatra. And then Sinatra eventually introduces Judy to a young senator named John F. Kennedy. And that is where things really become very complicated in this story.
And Roselli, he was like the mob's fixer. I mean, he had like a personal relationship with like Louis B. Mayer of MGM.
Yes,
So,
and Harry Cohn of
Harry Cohn,
Columbia Pictures. Yeah, they had they had rings that they exchanged, friendship rings that the two of them had exchanged. So that was part of Johnny's power, big part of his power, that and the unions out in Hollywood.
And what I find very interesting is Santo Trafficante was ultimately incorporated into this plot, but I think that he was, whereas Giancana and Roselli had some kind of patriotic feeling, I think that Trafficante was just very cynical and just going along for the money or something. What's your take on Santo Trafficante? He was the mob boss of Florida.
Right. Oh, he's arguably the most complicated character in this. Bear in mind what happens when Castro takes power in 1959. He throws out all of the U.S. business interests, including the casinos that reaped millions of dollars for the mafia that were controlling. The mob controlled a number of casinos in Cuba. Our guys here, our two mafia spies here, Giancana and Roselli, they particularly ran a casino named the San Sushi. And one of the people that they dealt with consistently was Santo Trafficante, who was a second generation gangster from Tampa. And he spoke Spanish. He was also a drug trafficker, and he ran gambling in the Tampa area. But it was Trafficante who joined Roselli and Sam Giancana at that meeting at the Boom Boom Room at the Fontainebleau Hotel in Miami, when really the whole effort was launched with the CIA to go kill Castro. And both Sam and Johnny thought that Trafficante was doing them a favor, that he had been involved in, that they trusted him. And they brought him in. They've all used aliases at the first meeting. But Santo Trafficante, whether or not he was really a double agent, whether or not he was an informer, was he playing both ends against the middle? Those documents that I looked at that became available 5 years ago, they portrayed Trafficante as a guy who may have been playing both ends against the middle, and for his own purposes, and particularly having to do with drug trafficking. A lot of drug traffic goes through the Caribbean and through Cuba. And so whether or not Trafficante was somehow sympathetic to Castro, at the same time he's saying that he's out to murder him, those documents make it pretty clear that he was a double agent. And it wasn't until a little bit later in the game that a CIA agent named William Harvey, who was Harvey was known as the James Bond of the CIA. He didn't look like James Bond, but more like Jackie Gleason than James
he was
Bond.
quite corpulent.
Yes, he was, but he was a tough, no nonsense, successful spy who had done great work over in Berlin and Europe, and they brought him in to basically get a grip on things and see what was going on, because they were not getting Castro. Things were not working out. And Harvey came to the conclusion that Johnny Roselli really was a, quote, patriot, that he wanted to sincerely help. Obviously the mob was motivated to get rid of Castro because they wanted to come back and recoup all the monies that they had lost when they were thrown out. But Harvey was very suspicious about Santo Trafficante. And in my book, it's pretty clear that he had more than sufficient reason to be suspicious of Trafficante.
Well, as you say in your book, Trafficante seems to have a covert pact with Castro to move drugs through Cuba into Florida.
Yeah, there's kind of a sketchy moment that happens when Castro takes over, in which for a time Trafficante was put in jail, and somehow, almost miraculously, but apparently with the help of Raul Castro, Fidel's brother, who was involved with Fidel running the government, Trafficante was able to get out of jail, something that most people wound up being at the end of a firing squad or just dying in jail. But somehow Trafficante got out. So that was always kind of a suspicious factor, certainly in the mind of somebody like Harvey and some others. Johnny Roselli still trusted Trafficante, or seemingly so, for quite a while. And but exactly how it plays out, as it does, it does play out in Mafia Spies over a number of years, but eventually Trafficante and Roselli and Giancana are asked to, in the mid-70s, to testify before the U.S. Senate about this. And by that point, I think things had really deteriorated among these three.
It's been rumored that Jack Ruby visited Trafficante when the Cubans incarcerated him. Have you found any information about that?
Well, that's been said. When you write a book like this, I, particularly as an investigative reporter, I like receipts. I like to have a document. So the back of my book has more than 600, 700, somewhere in that ballpark, footnotes at the back of the book with the precise documents. So there's a number of different things that I've heard out there. But I don't, if I wasn't relatively sure of it, I didn't put it in my book. Too many other crazy things that actually are true. I think that's the whole thing. I think when people look at this and say, is this really true? And yeah, it was. In fact, the CIA kind of dodged and whatever, but they officially acknowledged this plot to kill Castro in 2007. Took only 50, 60 years after the fact. It took a little while, but they released a top secret document that compiled all of the things that they were doing. It was called the Family Jewels document. That was its nickname. It was all the various different top secret things that the CIA had done, and that's where they confirmed the plot to kill Castro with these two gangsters.
Giancana had a relationship with a very popular singer at that point, Phyllis McGuire. And he was extremely jealous. And he told his CIA overseers that he thought she was having an affair with a popular comedian and to bug his room. And they actually bugged his room.
They did indeed. It's just life can be a tragedy, and times life can be a comedy. And this is one of the more comedic turning points in Mafia Spies. Imagine Sam is down there with Johnny Roselli and the CIA agents. They're training the Cuban exiles how to go and attack Castro. They're all training kind of like soldiers, and not kind of like, very much like soldiers. And that's when Sam finds out that Phyllis McGuire, this woman who I think Sam projected as a potential replacement for his wife, here was a woman that he could adore. Now, I think it was the wrong projection. I don't think that's what Phyllis really wanted from him or in life. She was a very successful singer, as you say. The McGuire sisters were a big act.
But she was in love with him, it seemed. I mean, that's what I gleaned from your book, that she was actually in love with this guy.
Yes. But getting married and being in love sometimes is two different people. In that sense, she was more like Johnny Roselli. Roselli, he loved women, but didn't necessarily want to get married. And I think that was kind of like Phyllis as well, and at least in that regard. But Sam was intensely jealous. In fact, there was a case in Chicago where somebody was fooling around with one of his girlfriends, and that guy was soon lost and never seen from again. So anyway, so he's down in Florida, and the CIA agents, particularly Mayu and Johnny Roselli, try to convince Sam, look, stay in Florida. We'll have a detective agency, that we know that we check this out. And when the detectives get caught, what happens is the security in the hotel sees these detectives trying to put a bug into the guy who was apparently trying to court Phyllis McGuire. And that happened to be a comedian by the name of Dan Rowan, later of Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In. That's how he was best known. But he gets wind of who was also involved in Phyllis's life, Sam Giancana. So he very smartly bows out very quickly. But when the security in the hotel find out about this, they call the cops call the sheriff calls the FBI, and lo and behold, eventually the head of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, who knew nothing about this plot by the CIA down in Florida, believe it or not, or certainly not the involvement of the two gangsters, shall we say, suddenly becomes aware of this whole plot. And they do that because they're able to trace it to Mayu, and Mayu coughs it up that he's involved with the CIA. And so when Hoover finds that out, they really ramp up their efforts. They already were running after Giancana and Roselli, but that's when things really take a dramatic turn.
It's kind of interesting. So Giancana is thinking about hitting Dan Rowan, the comedian.
Right.
And then Roselli and Giancana get together and they think that The Untouchables is not portraying Italian Americans the way that Italian Americans should be portrayed.
Right.
And they're thinking about putting a hit on Desi Arnaz.
Right. Lucy. Right.
So with these two guys together, there's no telling what's going to happen. What's interesting to me is in your version, when Bobby Kennedy learns about this Faustian pact with the mafia, he thinks it's a relatively good idea. In other versions, I've heard that he just fulminated and was very, very angry that this pact had been made.
Well, yeah, it's hard, particularly when you look at the most recent documents that were released. It's very clear that Bobby Kennedy was flying down to Florida and that he was very aware of what was going on with Harvey. In fact, there were arguments with William Harvey about that he wasn't getting rid of Castro fast enough. So I think historically, I think that as much as I admire Bobby Kennedy, particularly the Bobby Kennedy after his brother's assassination, Robert Kennedy, he's a whole other story, obviously, but he traveled and changed a great deal. You could say he grew a great deal just prior to his death. But in those years, 1964 to 68, he significantly changed from, say, the young man who worked for Senator Joseph McCarthy, or in this case, and the period that we're talking about here, which is during his brother's presidency. He's really offended by the fact that Castro was able to embarrass his brother, the president, with the disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion that took place very early in the Kennedy administration. And also the Kennedys were very strongly Catholic, but they're also very strongly anti-communist. And that was something that Bobby felt intensely. So, I think Mafia Spies is fair to Kennedy. But I do think that a lot of histories about Bobby Kennedy go pretty light and breezy about exactly how it was that the Attorney General of the United States was overseeing an undeclared war in Florida that included an attempt to kill a foreign leader. And so, I think I tried to explore that as much as possible.
Well, he eventually, one way or the other, gives a go-ahead with it, the assassination plot. So you've got Giancana, and then you've got Roselli. Giancana kind of drops out. Santo Trafficante, I think, is non-committal, but Johnny Roselli, he really wants to kill Castro as something patriotic. I mean, that's what I got from your book. I mean, he didn't even want any money. He just thought communism was something that was bad. And I guess if you're in the mafia, communism isn't a good thing.
Right. Well, you know, when they first offered $150,000, the CIA, that was the offer, which is, you know, by today's standards, well, I'd say over $1 million, certainly. $150,000 in 1960. Johnny said, no, 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 I'll do it for free. We'll do it for free. But let's not be too patriotic here in the sense that Johnny, and particularly Giancana, was aware that if they did something for the CIA, that it would be as if they were getting one of those get out of jail free cards in Monopoly. That, in other words, that Uncle Sam would get off their back, and that presumption was didn't pan out, was not true. In fact, if anything, you had this remarkable situation in which, on one level, the CIA is using these two gangsters to try to kill Castro, and is more than delighted with them about that. You know, the fact that they're willing to do that. On the other hand, you have the FBI with J. Edgar Hoover running after them all the time, particularly by the Kennedy administration. So eventually they clash, these two things, in ways that are really, truly remarkable.
Bobby goes after the mob like a pit bull. And according to Jimmy Hoffa, he said, you know, I got to really respect Robert Kennedy. He really knows how to hate. Because there was really intense antipathy between the two. And actually, Bobby Kennedy had really grilled Giancana prior to him becoming the attorney general.
Yeah, in fact, you know, it's funny because the person that I worked at Newsday with, who was my main editor, a guy named Bob Green, very well-known investigative reporter, but he originally worked on the Senate Rackets Committee with Bobby Kennedy and with Jack Kennedy. Jack Kennedy was then a senator from Massachusetts, and Bobby was a chief counsel for the Rackets Committee. So they were involved with that, and particularly Bobby was, you know, he was kind of the runt of the litter in the among the Kennedy men. He was the smaller, he's a tough guy in the sense that, because he had to be tough. He was one of the younger members of the family. I think he was the seventh child in the Kennedy brood there, and so he played hard-nosed football, hard-nosed anything that he did. And so, yeah, he definitely was somebody who felt very strongly about going after the mafia now that he was the attorney general. He had no idea, though, that his brother was involved with a woman, Judy Campbell, who was also involved with Sam Giancana and Johnny Roselli. And when he did, I think he was clearly very upset. It led to a meeting between President Kennedy and the FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover. And it was a private meeting. And right after that, the 2-year relationship between JFK and Judy Campbell came to a quick ending.
The Kennedys didn't particularly like Lyndon Johnson. And according to Evelyn Lincoln, who was Kennedy's secretary, Hoover actually blackmailed the Kennedys into putting Lyndon Johnson on their ticket as a vice president. Did you come across those stories at all when you were researching Mafia Spies?
No, I think it's a lot more likely that and a number of people historians whose accounts I trust, that it was Joe Kennedy. Joe Kennedy was certainly to the right of his sons, and he was familiar with Lyndon Johnson. He dealt with him before. And they felt that, bear in mind, in the 1960 election, the biggest issue in that campaign was not the economy, it wasn't the Soviet Union. It was the Kennedys' Catholicism, believe it or not. It's really hard to imagine until you go back and you look at the clips, like, say, from the New York Times. And so they really wanted to balance out the ticket, and carrying Texas was really huge, and having a Southerner on the ticket. So Jack Kennedy was convinced by his father and other people, but I think his father was a big factor there, more than anybody else in putting Johnson on the ticket. I mean, there's nobody else that could have twisted Bobby Kennedy's arm, and Bobby almost from the outset did not like LBJ. The only one who could really twist Bobby's arm like that was his father.
At a certain point, they really, Roselli anyway, makes an assiduous effort to kill Castro, but none of those plans come to fruition, which is kind of amazing. And you've got all these attempts on Castro's life. Seemingly the fountainhead is Johnny Roselli, and none of them go anywhere. I mean, how can you account for that? I just found that was, you would think that if they really wanted to kill the guy, they could have killed the guy.
You would think so, wouldn't you? I think with the Bay of Pigs, the attempt was that somehow they would be able to also kill and assassinate Castro simultaneously. There were attempts even when Castro came to New York early on. The CIA tried to provide an exploding cigar, believe it or not. Oh, no, a poisoned cigar, excuse me, for Castro. And the New York City police commissioner who was overseeing that visit said, no, we're not getting, somehow he was tipped off about it. There were a number of different attempts, but it is one of the most extraordinary mysteries, curiosities about how is it that the much vaunted CIA couldn't kill Castro if it really wanted to, or did it really want to? I think they definitely did want to, but some of the people that they were involved with had other motives going on, most notably Santo Trafficante, but also, as I mentioned, those papers that were released about 5 years ago. It shows that a number of people who were pretty actively involved in attempts to kill Castro, they seem to have other compromising interests that were going on. And so were these folks also providing information to the Castro government? And why did they do that? And there's a variety of reasons why they did that. But the big takeaway for me in looking at these newly released documents was just that Castro not only had his own network in Cuba, but he was getting information so that, well, I'll give you a good example. There's a particular instance in the book that's detailed about how Johnny Roselli goes out in a boat late at night with a whole group of Cuban exiles, and they go to a particular point in the middle of the night, dark of night, to the Cuban shore. Well, when they get there, Castro's security forces are waiting for them. In fact, they start firing at Roselli and these Cuban exile boats. And the boat that Roselli's in actually takes on water, and he has to jump out of the boat, and eventually they flee. But there's a number of cases like that, either poisons, attacks, try to shoot or somehow some type of explosions with Castro, and somehow amazingly Castro avoids assassination. It's one of I certainly detail a number of the cases, including the Marita Lorenz attempts at poisoning, but somehow there was always a reason that Castro escaped assassination.
And there were hit squads, not only the one with Roselli, but there were other hit squads that seemed to be apprehended very quickly when they showed up in Cuba.
Yeah. So that's the whole thing, that Harvey, who was this, as I mentioned, vaunted James Bond of the CIA, when he comes in, try to figure out what's going on here and, try to straighten it out, he comes to that, say, what's going on? And that's when he begins to realize, well, wait a minute. Some of these characters that we're dealing with, like Santo Trafficante, he has suspicions. Harvey even had suspicions about Giancana. I think what happened with Giancana is that he had so many fish to fry back in Chicago. He was running the mob in Chicago, and he was under a lot of pressure there for a variety of reasons. So he also had one of the asides in my book. That's not even the TV series, just because we've got so many things going on. But Giancana had another guy that he had sent down to get involved with the attempts to kill Castro. So, Giancana was in and out, but Roselli was the constant, the one who was deeply committed to trying to get rid of Castro.
What amazes me is the CIA couldn't kill one guy. I mean, they fomented a coup in Iran, in Guatemala, in South Vietnam, in Chile, in Indonesia. I mean, it can go on and on and on. So they're able to create regime changes in these countries, but yet they couldn't kill Fidel Castro. It's kind of mind-boggling to me.
It is. Bear in mind, Castro from the very beginning, virtually from the very beginning, brought in the Russians. And the Russians, they have a long history of spying. Other countries, certainly the Nazis, for instance, the Germans, prior to World War II, had a number of spies in the United States. Certainly the British have a long history of espionage. Certainly Winston Churchill, for instance, was very aware and very supportive of the need for a good spy system and such. The United States, somewhat reflective of our isolationist history to some extent. But, we had an agency in World War I, that was very short-lived. And eventually the Secretary of State, I believe it was Henry Stimson, said, well, gentlemen do not read other gentlemen's mail. And that's the reason why we didn't want an intelligence service. And we didn't have one going into World War II. We had to create one for World War II. And then even after World War II was over, Truman disassembled that agency and then realized his mistake about 3 years later, and he created the Central Intelligence Agency. So which began in about 1947, I believe. So, our view was kind of somewhat ambivalent about the whole thing about spying. And initially, we were essentially collecting information, economic and political information, but we were more passive. What this represents is another aspect, which is covert operations. In other words, instead of being passive observers, we became active agents in other countries. We'd been involved in other countries prior to this, but this one was where we're actually attempting to kill a foreign leader. And this is really the first known foray by the United States into the assassination business. And, it's interesting today, we see with the Supreme Court's debate about this, it was interesting to see during the arguments about presidential immunity, Justice Clarence Thomas mentioned this case, Operation Mongoose, which was the overall secret plan to kill Castro. He actually mentioned that in the oral arguments. And it begs a question, in the dissent by Justice Sotomayor about presidential immunity, she talks about, well, could the president hire a hitman to get rid of a political enemy and somehow be immune from that? And that's her criticism of the majority ruling here. So, what I'm getting at is there's a lot of debate about assassination. What should we be doing here? And I think Mafia Spies is a really good example of what happens when we get into this and all the unintended consequences that may occur.
Well, what's interesting to me is, like, in Iran, we fomented a coup there, and Mohammad Mossadegh was definitely killed because of that coup. And Arbenz in Guatemala, he wanted to introduce some type of socialism there, and we overthrew him, and he was definitely murdered. And the same thing with President Diem in Vietnam in, I believe,
Right.
1963. And the president of Chile, who was trying to nationalize various um, corporations. And then when Pinochet took over, he was murdered. So
Yeah.
there is that element that these leaders are getting murdered because of CIA coups.
In my book, I quote a guy named Sam Halpern, who was the #2 for William Harvey. And in the testimony that he gave that had been kept secret, he says that it was JFK from the very outset said he wanted an assassination capability as soon as he came in. Um, and that was part of the first batch of materials. And subsequently, a little bit later batch that was released, this is like 5 years ago, Harvey said essentially the same thing. Now, both of them were really upset with the Kennedys because they felt that they took a lot of the criticism for something that the Kennedys were the ones who were pushing the CIA to go kill Castro. So they, you have to figure that into it. But both of them testified and said that Kennedy wanted some type of assassination capability from the very outset. More to your point, Nick, bear in mind, it's not always so easy, though. One of the reasons I think to keep in mind with this, the man who oversaw all of this, Allen Dulles, who was the head of the CIA when this whole operation was approved and launched, Allen Dulles was really a terrific spy during World War II. That's where he made his bones. It was working in Bern, Switzerland. But anybody who came out of the World War II experience, particularly in the intelligence world, there was a debate about, geez, if we had assassinated Adolf Hitler early on, think of all the lives that could have been saved, all the chaos and catastrophe that could have somehow been avoided if we had killed Hitler. And there were attempts to kill during the war, attempts to kill Hitler, and it wasn't always so easy. So, sometimes it's a matter of circumstances, it's a matter of security, it's a matter of informants, and just, and sometimes sheer luck with this. But, with Mafia Spies, I am trying to beg the question about assassination, because after this whole situation with Mafia Spies, when it came to light, President Ford, this is in the area of 1976, when it all started coming to light in Senate hearings, Ford issued a ban on assassinations. But we certainly have seen in more recent years the use of drones, essentially to kill foreign leaders or foreign enemies who are perceived as political dangers to the United States defense. And so, and particularly even in light of even the Supreme Court decision about immunity, I think we have to really ask ourselves, what place does assassination have? Does it have any place in our foreign policy? If so, who's going to oversee it? What are the circumstances? And then what are the legal consequences? So as entertaining as this story is, I think it has some pretty profound questions to be raised for today's political situation.
This story did not have a happy ending for Sam Giancana and Johnny Roselli. Sam Giancana he's getting harassed by law enforcement and summoned before grand jurors, and ultimately the outfit, although he was the boss, it's kind of, I mean, you could make an argument that Arcado was the boss, or Arcado, I don't know.
Accardo, yes.
Accardo, yeah. I mean, you could make a pretty strong case that although Sam Giancana was the titular head of the Chicago Mafia, Arcado, was the one that was calling a lot of shots. And Sam Giancana went to Mexico to avoid American law enforcement.
He did. In writing this book, it did. In the back of my mind, it always struck me almost like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. You have these two outlaw friendships, but as things go on, Sam, in the case of Sam, his much publicized relationship with Phyllis McGuire and then with Frank Sinatra, he got his name in the paper, and it really invited a lot of scrutiny, even more scrutiny, by the FBI running after the mob. And so the senior people who had given the reins to the mafia, and bear in mind, the Chicago mob was the biggest and most powerful mafia organization in the United States. In New York, we were very well aware from like The Godfather and others, but there are 5 different families in New York, mafia families, and there were rivalries often in the case. In Chicago, fundamentally, it's the outfit, as it's called, was the one mob family that was essentially founded by Al Capone, or certainly that was his most notable figure. Capone was like John Gotti. He loved living big. He invited scrutiny by the feds, and eventually he went to jail. And all of the other mobsters in Chicago were really scorched by that. So the people that gave the reins to Giancana essentially told him, they gave it to him because he's a suburbanite married with the 3 teenage daughters out in the suburbs, even mows his own lawn. They said, they thought he would be stable. And that he would keep a very low profile. Most importantly, keep a low profile. Instead, he did just the opposite. He goes out to Las Vegas and he invites all of scrutiny. So eventually they had enough in Chicago. And rather than a shootout, it was organized that Giancana would go to Mexico. And he was involved with a lot of different casinos in other countries and things of that nature. And then eventually he's thrown out of Mexico, and he comes back to Chicago. And by that point, it's the mid 1970s. There's a Senate hearings that's looking at the use or misuse of intelligence services, particularly the CIA. The U.S. Senate is having hearings, and they subpoena Sam Giancana. And so there's 2 investigators who actually fly out to Chicago to prep him for his testimony. And that same night, Giancana has one of his daughters for dinner and some friends. They go home that night, and Sam has like this man cave that he has in the basement of his home. He's got like a little stove there, and he's making himself a little snack of sausages and peppers, when somebody with a gun and a silencer comes in and fires 6 times into his head, including 5 of those bullets were around his mouth, which was kind of it's a telltale way of saying anybody who talks is going to wind up just like this guy. It's a message. And so that was the end of Sam Giancana. What happens to Johnny Roselli?
What's interesting about that is
mm-hmm.
Giancana, I don't think ever talked. And just his nature. He was omerta. He seemed to be he was a little crazy about hanging out with Phyllis McGuire and Frank Sinatra, and he sued the FBI for harassment. But it seems like omerta was in his marrow. Were there any indications that he was going to talk?
Well, in the history of the mob, you could say Sammy the Bull Gravano in New York, omerta was in his blood. Eventually they flipped. Who knows? Sam did go to jail earlier rather than flip, and rather than cooperate with the feds. But bear in mind, the commission, the other major mobsters around the country, they were not aware of the involvement of Giancana and Roselli in this whole episode. In fact, most of the mobsters back in 1960, they apparently were for Nixon, but it was Giancana and Roselli that were for Kennedy, and they also never told the other mobsters about this cooperation, the plot to kill Castro. So I think there was that, and also, frankly, when he came back, Tony Accardo, who had to come back out of retirement to run things in Chicago for the mob, he was disgusted with what was going on. But who killed Sam Giancana? That's interesting, because the local cops and even the local FBI thought it was a local job that was done. One of the things that I found in my research is that the person who killed that killed Sam Giancana, apparently either heard the cops, but about a mile or so away, apparently this assassin took the gun and flung it out of the window of a car, and it was later recovered. And that gun was traced back to a gun shop, not in the Chicago area, but in the Tampa area, the home territory of Santo Trafficante. So I tend to think that this was more of an outsider who came in, that somehow something happened there. Trafficante was involved with another assassination earlier in New York. In fact, it was a guy that the killing was in a barber shop, and it was kind of replicated.
Are you talking
in the guy? Yeah, exactly. Anastasia wanted a major piece, like 50% of what was going on down in Havana with some of the casinos. And Trafficante came up, stayed at the Warwick Hotel in Manhattan. The demands were made for the 50%, and 2 days later, before Trafficante left town, that barbershop scene, that's barbershop assassination. It was
thought that the gallows hit.
Well, that's right. And it's kind of like what happened, the theories about Giancana. So in other words, the local cops, the local FBI thinks it's the people that they know, and they speculate upon the smaller pool of possible suspects that they're aware of. But when you pull back and you look at some of the other things that were going on, you say, oh, okay. And like I said, the tracing of the gun in the Giancana murder really seems, to me at least, to lead back to Tampa, the home base of Santo Trafficante.
I had read that it was Joey Aiuppa who ultimately hit Sam, and he ultimately became the boss of the Chicago outfit.
Right. Well, I think the one that's often mentioned locally is a guy named Butch Blasey. And then I know that, for instance, Antoinette Giancana says, no way, that wasn't him. Now, she may be all wrong. But there was a guy in Chicago named Bill Romer, who was kind of a rah-rah, very big, kind of a hot dog in a way, but very dedicated FBI agent running after Giancana and such. Now, he thought he knew everything about him. He didn't know about the Cuba connection with Giancana, because it wasn't just being picked up on the illegally placed microphones. Yeah, mum's the word. So, I've seen that even as a reporter. Sometimes if you're so caught up in the world of the local world, you don't necessarily put into consideration other outside factors. And, I think that's part of it. From what I see, and from what I see in the suspicions that were expressed by outside, like the FBI and the CIA, and even some of the investigators with the Roselli murder, that Trafficante seems to be a factor in both the murder of Giancana and Sam Giancana and Johnny Roselli.
I met Joey Aiuppa. I was visiting a friend of mine who got busted selling marijuana. a lot of marijuana.
Right. Those were the days, huh?
So he ended up in Rochester, and that's where Joey Aiuppa was. And Joey Aiuppa had let him push. Joey Aiuppa was in a wheelchair at that point, and Joey Aiuppa had let my friend push him around in his wheelchair, and that was that was a major accomplishment. It showed that if Joey Aiuppa lets you push him around in his wheelchair, then you're not a bad guy. You're a stand-up guy. But
I
did meet him. That was kind of interesting. He struck me as a very cold guy. I mean,
yeah. Well, if you saw Trafficante, he looked like a bookkeeper. He looked like somebody. Often he would wear a bow tie, very nondescript, but he was a cold-blooded killer and very calculating. And he was able to manipulate a lot of the things that he was involved in.
You made an argument in your book, and I believe it. You make the argument that it was really Trafficante who was the prime mover and responsible for Roselli's death. And prior to that, I hadn't known what to make of it. With Giancana too, I didn't know whether it was the CIA or the Mafia, or it was tough to know. But you make a pretty good argument that it was Trafficante, because Roselli had used his name so prolifically and put heat on Trafficante that Trafficante definitely didn't want. That Trafficante was the prime mover. I think that the way that you lay it out, I agreed with it.
Yeah, I mean, Johnny was pretty aware that he had a target on his back. And in fact, he went to dinner with Trafficante a few weeks before he was murdered. I think Trafficante's wife was there, and Johnny's sister, who lived in Florida. And he had basically fled to Florida to try to lay low there. But I think at this point, it was a last gasp effort by Johnny, who always considered Trafficante a friend. And, they had known each other by that point for almost 20 years. Right. That's about 1976. So yeah, about at least in that ballpark, close to 20 years. That's dating back all the way back to the Sans Souci, when they ran that casino in Havana. So he clearly pled for. It was interesting about Johnny also, how Johnny, aside from how he loved women and how he cared for women. Judy Campbell, after the JFK assassination, he reaches out to her when she's clearly suicidal and such. And I thought that was really interesting, what happens there. But he also kind of was a Catholic had some sense of religiosity. In fact, his name, Johnny Roselli, is not his real name. It was an alias. The FBI finds out his real name, and that leads partly to his demise when they find out, and they threaten to deport him. And Johnny says, well, he basically says, he tries to stay in the country by suggesting through his lawyer that he knows something about the JFK assassination. But he also, I know I'm jumping around here a little bit, but Johnny, I thought it was interesting how he gave money to various Catholic charities, and he almost is aware that he's got this target on his back, and he's almost trying to repent, or at least somehow account for his life. And he goes and reaches out to a priest that he knows. So there's, when I could ever add more dimension to these characters beyond like a cartoon character, I tried to do that. I was always interested in that. In fact, Johnny Roselli that name Roselli comes from a Vatican painter, believe it or not, Cosimo Roselli. And that's the name that Johnny adopts as an alias when he comes early on in his life as an illegal Italian immigrant with his mother and his family. They come to Boston. He gets into trouble. He goes to Chicago, and he works early on as a driver, as a young man for Capone. And for health reasons, He has tuberculosis. They send him to Los Angeles to work with the LA mob there. And he becomes the Chicago's guy out in Hollywood. But he's known as Johnny Roselli. His real name was Filippo Sacco. And when the FBI eventually finds out his real identity, that becomes the turning point for Johnny.
They put a lot of heat on him. And
a load of heat, yes.
things didn't end up well for Johnny Roselli. Why don't you tell us about the condition of his remains?
His demise there. Yeah. Well, what happens is he actually told his sister and his brother-in-law, who he was dealing with, he was borrowing their car, and Johnny liked to golf. And he said, basically, he kind of said that if I don't show up, look for me in the airport. So look for this car in the airport, and something to that effect. And actually, when he goes missing, they do look for him, and they find the car, and there's the golf clubs there, but no Johnny. And then a couple of weeks go by. But bear in mind, back in Washington, where they've subpoenaed Roselli, and he's told them initially and begrudgingly some detail about the CIA plot against Castro, but he's dangling this idea that he knows something about the JFK assassination. And then so that they're interested in getting him on the record about that. He winds up dead. He goes missing. 2 weeks later, a couple of fishermen in the waters of the bay, not too far from the Fontainebleau Hotel in Miami, where all of this starts. Up comes a 55-gallon barrel filled with the body parts of Johnny Roselli, and that is his demise. And it's extremely shocking to the Senate investigators, who now have had two key witnesses that wind up murdered.
With Robert Blakey was the primary counsel for the House Committee on Assassinations, and he concluded that the mafia was involved in Kennedy's assassination. Did you come to any conclusions like that, or?
No. You know why? I'll tell you why. Because well, first of all, I've done other books about the Kennedys. My first book that I did about the Kennedys, I actually found the priest, a Jesuit priest, who counseled Jackie Kennedy, and exchanged letters. And he played tennis in Bobby Kennedy's backyard, essentially his therapy sessions. That was new. That made that made news. It was in the New York Times. It was on CBS Evening News, the Today Show. That was real. That was real truth. I had, the documents. I had the tape recorded interview with the priest with my interview. But with this, often people say, who killed JFK? And I say, I don't know. I mean, anybody who's in their right man, except beyond Lee Harvey Oswald, there's still a lot of questions. And the biggest question, though, of all, is why did the Warren Commission not examine all of the suspects, and particularly Fidel Castro and the CIA plot? And when John F. Kennedy was killed, it was suggested by Bobby Kennedy to LBJ to put Allen Dulles and John McCloy on the Warren Commission,
which is pretty stunning.
It seemed like it was responsible.
Did fire him. I mean, I was really surprised. I didn't know how he ended up on the Warren Commission, but that's a very interesting passage in your book.
Yeah, it's all, there's actual documents. It was Nicholas, I forget his last name. Yes, thank you. And he was a number 2 for Bobby in the Justice Department, and he was essentially the conduit of information. And it was suggested to to Johnson's administration. I think Bill Moyers, believe it or not, who was then an aide to LBJ. He was involved in, I think, some of those conversations. But nevertheless, Allen Dulles, for good purposes, was put on the Warren Commission, I'm sure, at least in the mind of Johnson at that time. And but according to all accounts, Alan Dulles really steered the commission away from any thorough examination about what had happened, and really, those members were not told of the top secret plan to kill Castro. And I just don't know how you do a murder investigation if you don't identify all your possible suspects. And so it's pretty clear that they didn't consider that. That's a huge hole. I know that, for instance, Gerald Ford, who was a member, he was in the House at that time in 1964. He was a member of the Warren Commission. And when this all came out in the mid 70s, when by that point Ford was president, he made it very clear that he didn't know, and he wished he had been told about that.
It's interesting. I had Jefferson Morley on my podcast about 3 weeks ago, and he wrote a book called Scorpion's Dance about Nixon and Richard Helms. And at one point, Nixon has got Helms in the White House, and he's grilling him, who shot John? Who shot John? Because Nixon had concluded that the CIA played some kind of role in it. And Dick Helms is just kind of, he's not really saying too much when Nixon's grilling him about who shot John. It's kind of an interesting impasse. And I have a tendency to believe that Lee Harvey Oswald didn't act alone, but that would be the stuff of another podcast.
That's exactly right.
And,
It's there. I certainly raise questions about, particularly about the Warren Commission. I think that the fact that they were not told about this Mafia Spies plot, I think it's really remarkable omission, to say the least, by in examining who killed JFK. But I've done 3 Kennedy books. I don't try to offer something like that. When you do, years ago, I did a big investigation for Newsday about murders, and I learned a lot from all the various different experts about murders investigations. And generally speaking, if you don't identify somebody within about 72 hours, it's going to become significantly more difficult to solve a murder. And unfortunately, within that 72 hours, you had the leading suspect, Lee Harvey Oswald, himself assassinated, killed by Jack Ruby. So that was a screwed up investigation from almost the outset. And it's unfortunate because it lends itself, among other things, to crazy conspiracy theories, almost a cottage industry in conspiracy theories. And then people say, well, what's true and what's not true, and such. And we deserve more. We deserve more openness. At least with my book, I have receipts for everything. If I don't know it relatively for sure, I didn't put it in the book.
in 1967 or 68, there was a quote unquote dispatch that was sent to various editors and people that had juice. It was from the FBI. It was from the CIA, and the CIA, because a lot of people just weren't buying the Warren Commission at that point. And the CIA said, we're going to take the people that don't believe in the Warren Commission, and we're going to position them as quote unquote conspiracy theorists. So, and once that dispatch was disseminated, the term conspiracy theorist and conspiracy theory just went up exponentially. It was used about once a year in the New York Times and the Washington Post. So I've always thought that was kind of interesting, that the CIA weaponized conspiracy theory.
Yeah, well, with this, there was so much going on that unless I found something surprising, and I have done that in some of my other books, I wasn't going to try to solve the JFK murder. I was
much bigger.
Absolutely. I was much more interested in the reaction, like some of the characters, like for instance with Judy Campbell. I think that's one of the more interesting aspects of the book. Judy Campbell is often historically portrayed as a floozy, quote unquote, floozy and such. But I didn't see her quite that way. I saw her as a young woman who got caught up in a dark and deep world of swirling currents of very powerful men, not unlike a Monica Lewinsky in the sense of she's certainly willing in the sexual aspects of the engagements that she has with arguably the best known entertainer in the world, Frank Sinatra, the top mobster in the country, Sam Giancana, and ultimately the most powerful politician in the world, JFK. But she is nonetheless way above her capabilities there. And it's interesting, after the JFK assassination, where a lot of things fall apart, including the effort to try to kill Castro, it's Johnny Roselli who reaches out to her, and that human aspect was something that I was always intrigued with. And as I said, the two men as two archetypes, two different types, but very clear different types of men. The guy Sam Giancana, who falls apart when his wife, who he adores and puts up on a pedestal, and then he's left with 3 teenage daughters. And then you have Johnny, who's smooth and it's just one of these men that how women who are smart and accomplished women like Phyllis McGuire and some of these other actresses who I mentioned, they get involved with a mobster. And this attraction of bad boys and such.
Bad boy.
I found that really an interesting thing. And also, that whole era of the 60s, it's really a pivotal moment in America that we still are looking at in many ways. And Mafia Spies involved, it's got stuff going down in Florida with this. With the attempts to kill Castro, what happened down in Cuba, but also the world of Las Vegas, of Hollywood, and of course in Washington, the way the mafia ran in the biggest family, which is Chicago, not New York. Most of the well-known things about the mafia have been out of New York. But this one really looks at the operation of the Chicago mob and incorporates it into a much bigger story.
Thomas, I really want to thank you for coming on the Nick Bryant podcast. I found your book very edifying.
Nick, thank you so much for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
And have yourself a great night.
You too.